Shields up, Ironbreakers. We're kind of here coming at you with another video. Welcome back to Final Fantasy XIV, and today we're finally going to be talking about Shadowbringers and 14 as a whole. Now, before we begin, I would like to thank Square Enix for providing me with access to the game as well as game time so that I could play each of these expansions at my own pace and provide you guys with my impressions on each and every one of them. However, I would also like to say that the deeper I got into the whole Final Fantasy XIV story arc, the harder it becomes to kind of like isolate each individual expansion, because this is an actual story that is connected throughout all of the story arcs of this particular game, and they are much more meaningful than things that I experienced in previous games in the same genre. Whereas, you know, while they still tell like an overarching story, a lot of the stuff that happens in expansion number 1 maybe doesn't matter at all for expansion number 3. In Final Fantasy XIV, that is clearly not the case, and the stuff that takes place in Shadowbringers is that much more meaningful if you experience these characters from the get-go. Shadowbringers is considered by a lot of people, myself included, to be one of the best stories Final Fantasy has ever told, and a lot of the power of that story comes from the fact that these are characters that you've been interacting with for a long time, and not knowing the depth of all of the events that these characters have been through means that the story itself is not going to hit you quite as hard as if you had experienced the entirety of the Final Fantasy XIV arc. If you still want to skip right to Shadowbringers, feel free to do so, but I would advise you not to do it. And really quickly, I will also tell you that you might think, oh, like all of the other MMOs, the only thing that really matters is the final expansion. That is not the case in Final Fantasy XIV, because a big focus, at least for me, of the Final Fantasy XIV experience is the story itself, because it's just a really good story all around. Like, I cannot emphasize this enough. Not just Shadowbringers, also A Realm Reborn. And some people might tell you, oh, but A Realm Reborn's got a lot of like filler, and it's a bit of a drag, and it drags on. It's like, but it is worth it once you reach Heavensward, once you start experiencing the story of Heavensward that is made that much better by the events that took place in A Realm Reborn. And then you hit Stormblood, which personally I didn't like that much. But the ending bits of Stormblood, when you get to like the post-MSQ stuff, when Stormblood really starts kind of like kicking off into Shadowbringers territory, and then eventually you get the Shadowbringers and just like your mind starts blowing up from all of the shit that is happening. And all of this is made much more meaningful from experiencing the entirety of the story, and the content is not insignificant. And even, you know, like dungeons, because you might think like, oh, but I'm gonna have a tough time doing these earlier dungeons. There's people running dungeons all the time in this game. The population is extremely healthy, and the dungeons are made relevant even in endgame, because there's this roulette system, and players are actually rewarded for doing lower level dungeons with meaningful rewards that impact their endgame characters. So there's basically a lot of reasons for people to run older dungeons, older trials, even older raids, and, you know, usually stuff is popular. The one raid that I wish there was more reasons for people to do, and I'm not sure if they're planning on doing something about it, is Coils of Bahamut. That's the one that you usually can get through, but I would advise you, after you finish like Realm Reborn, if you do plan on playing Final Fantasy XIV and going through Realm Reborn and all of these things, I'd advise you to at least watch the cinematics on YouTube, because the story bits of Coil of Bahamut are extremely important for you to understand the events of Realm Reborn and just like Final Fantasy XIV as a whole. But anyway, let's focus our attention back a little bit on Shadowbringers. So a lot of things change in terms of the story. One of the things that I really appreciated is the fact that they dropped one of the characters that I personally like the least, which is Lise. She gets dropped on the tail end of Stormblood. She's like, oh, I'm just gonna stay here and organize this thing over in Alamigo and whatever. And I was like, thank God. Like, I'll be honest, I did not care for Lise. Like, I know maybe some people liked Lise. I did not care for Lise at all. So the fact that at the end of Stormblood, they just kind of like wrote her off, I'm like, good. I don't want to have to deal with her anymore. And then they focus on the other characters that you actually care about, like another character, and again, I'm trying to do this as spoiler-free as possible. Another character that I thought really had a lot of character development throughout this particular expansion was Thancred, whereas it felt like pretty much since some of the events that took place in Heavensward, Thancred was almost like a throwaway character. It's like, hey, we need someone to do some spy shit. Okay, send Thancred in there. This time around, it was very different. Thancred takes the stage front and center for a lot of the stuff that happens, and there's even a very special moment in the story that I cannot talk about because of spoilers that I really, man, it was just like friggin' awesome. And then you also get to interact with characters that you haven't seen in a good long while. I don't really remember when the Warrior of Darkness arc took place. I think it was either Heavensward. I think it was during Heavensward that the Warrior of Darkness arc starts taking place. But again, this whole thing is like mixed to me. To me, it's just like one big game and no longer like these different expansions that we've gone through, right? But the fact that the Warrior of Darkness arc eventually pays off in Shadowbringers is just another one of those things. They keep planting these seeds that, you know, you at the time you experience these little bits of story and you're like, well, you know, this doesn't really seem like it's going to go anywhere. It was just like this little bit of story for this thing. But then later down the line, in a future expansion, it's like, oh, no, this was very important. And here's the stuff that happened with these characters. And you're like, holy crap. And to give you guys an idea, some of the events, I mean, the very beginning events of Shadowbringers and all the way through to the end, like some of the seeds that were planted were all the way back in Realm Reborn. In Realm Reborn, some of the characters you interact with in Realm Reborn, one character in particular that I can't talk about, is going to be like a main character in Shadowbringers. And I think that a lot of people will probably have even forgotten about him, but I think I got like, I don't know, 10 hours into Shadowbringers, and I was like, okay, this dude right here, this really important character, I know who he is, and they don't reveal his identity until like very close to the end of the game, and I was like, I know who he is, I know it, I remember because I did that thing. And for those of you that don't know, the way that I went through the game was like, okay, so I would do a Realm Reborn. After Realm Reborn, I would do all of the raids in a Realm Reborn before actually progressing into the MSQ for Heavensward. And I did Heavensward, all of the Heavensward raids, and then I progressed into Stormblood. Then Stormblood, all the Stormblood. I did this all throughout. And right now, I'm finally actually caught up in terms of content. I just did the 24-man raid of Shadowbringers, which is friggin' amazing. It's really cool. And then I did the two raid tiers of the 8-man raid, which it was just like it was so cool because there's so many like references to Final Fantasy VIII, which was actually the first Final Fantasy that I've ever played, and just listening to those tunes, I was like, man, it just really put me in the mood every time I would go into that raid. Like, super cool. So I enjoyed the raids. I enjoyed the dungeons. The dungeons, by the way, of Shadowbringers, really, really cool. And here's another cool thing that they added in Shadowbringers, which is the trusts system, which basically is if you're the kind of person that does not like to play in a group setting, like if every time, because there are certain points during the story of Final Fantasy XIV, whether it's Shadowbringers or Heavensward or Stormblood, there's always going to be a point in the story where you have to do dungeons. Dungeons are actually a part of the story. So in Shadowbringers, they put this system in that actually allows you to take some of the main story characters into the dungeons with you, as opposed to going with a group of players. Now, the group of players is still much more efficient at clearing dungeons. Well, most of the time, at least. Not always. But most of the time, a group of players will be the faster and more efficient way to get through a dungeon. But in case, for whatever reason, you don't feel like interacting with other people, you just feel like chilling out, and you don't want to have to, depend on other players to do a dungeon that you want to do, you can just take the trusts in there with you, which are basically like some of the main characters. Like, for instance, you can take Alphino, Alisaie, Thancred. You can take all of those into a dungeon, and they will fight alongside you, which was actually a really cool thing, because you finally get to see these characters, which you don't always see them in combat with you unless you're like in a scripted scenario or something like that. A lot of the times, just like for a little bit, they get to fight with you, but then it's over. having them be able to fight with you alongside in a dungeon, I thought was really cool. Even if, like I said, they're not the best teammates. I mean, they're efficient, but they will never AoE, which is just like a big problem when you're just like pulling in a dungeon and there's a big AoE of mobs and they're just like slowly whittling them down one by one. But it is a cool solution, and it allows you to like level up your alts if you happen to be, for instance, a DPSer and you don't have any other people in a queue and you're just like stuck in a queue. You can take the trusts in and you can just do these dungeons regardless. Trials, on the other hand, which for those of you that do not know, Trials is like one boss fight usually with 8 players. Those still have to be made by players. It would be cool if they would implement some kind of like a trust system in Trials. I think that the problem there becomes that the trusts would probably have to carry most people through the trial, on account of the fact that if the trusts can't pull their own weight, the trial would be a complete nightmare to deal with. So I don't know if they're gonna implement something like that later down the line, but you know, you still have to do trials with other players, so there's that. But overall, I felt like the pacing of Shadowbringers was much better, particularly when you're coming off of Stormblood, where I felt that the pacing was just like terrible. At the very start, at least, I felt that the pacing was really bad. Near the end, the pacing greatly improves, but at the very start of Stormblood, the pacing was terrible. I felt like the pacing of Shadowbringers, by complete contrast, was 150,000 billion times better. And the fact that basically you get to interact with each of the main characters on a very personal level in their, these personal quests that they're going to be on during the story of Shadowbringers, I thought was really cool. It really fleshed out the characters. It really brings some of the knowledge that you have about these characters into the forefront, and it makes you understand what motivates them, what makes them tick, why are they the way that they are, and why they choose to do the things they do. And it's really cool. This is all made even better by the fact that I've instantly noticed improvements in the cinematic quality of the game, in terms of like, the cinematics that you see. They're better animated all around. The voice acting, there's more of it, like I said at the start of this video, at least I think, or it might have been a different take, but either way, the voice acting is fantastic. The delivery that the actors do all around is just friggin' great, and it just all really peaks into this story moment near the end, where even just yesterday, again, I'm trying to discuss this without any spoilers. I might do a little bit of a spoilery thing closer to the end of the video, but like, even yesterday, I was looking through some of the cutscenes to kind of like remind myself of the story, because in between making this video, I played through the entirety of Neo, so I kind of forgot a couple of things, but I was looking through the whole story to remember the entirety of the story arc of Shadowbringers, and I watched one of the final cutscenes that was very special to me. And even then, even after having already witnessed it and having experienced it, like, I could still feel the tears coming. I was like, oh man, this scene's just it's so powerful. And I understand that not everybody is going to connect with the game on the same level. So for some people, the story is going to be better. For other people, it's going to be worse. For me, it hit just right. And this is one of the reasons why Final Fantasy XIV essentially became my favorite MMORPG. And I understand that, here's the thing, it's not going to be the best MMORPG for everyone. And let me explain why. Because a lot of people come to MMORPGs and they want a sandbox experience. And that is not Final Fantasy XIV at all. And I don't think that is ever going to be Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV is like an MMORPG if you like JRPGs, which is why I specifically even say MMORPG as opposed to just MMO, because a lot of times people just abbreviate it to MMO, but this is not Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV is MMORPG. I would even say MMOJRPG, because it's very much story driven. It has no problems with making you, just like a lot of the quests that you do, just be about your character going somewhere and witnessing an event with no combat whatsoever. Like, there's a lot of quests in this game that are like that. And if you're the kind of guy that you just want to have like combat all the time. You just want to be collecting the 10 bear butts or whatever. This is definitely not the game for you, because they have no problem just like, hey, the next hour of gameplay is going to be you interacting with other characters and seeing character development and really fleshing out the story. And that is one of the things that at the start annoyed me a little bit. It annoyed me a lot, actually, I should say. And this is not about just Shadowbringers specifically. This, like I said, this video is about Shadowbringers, but also about Final Fantasy XIV as a whole. There were a lot of situations during 14 where I was like, oh my God, it's just talk, talk, talk. But the more you experience those things, the more you see the character development, the more you see how the story is advancing, the more you almost begin to crave those moments where it's like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So long as they bring voice acting. Because to me, it's very hard when the scene does not have voice acting. Not because I don't like reading, but because I streamed the whole thing and I'm expected to read it out loud. And that takes quite a bit of a toll on my throat, I'll tell you what. Like, reading all of the text in Final Fantasy XIV, the MSQ out loud, was insane. And this was one of the things that really turned me off of the Stormblood 24 man, because there was just like so much stuff. I was like, dude, I can't take it anymore. But yeah, overall, the entirety of the arc itself is tremendously satisfying. Another thing that I've barely even touched on throughout this video is the music, and I feel like it really needs to be said that the music throughout the entire experience has been fantastic. Pretty much every time you hear the tune Answers, like most people that are into the story, like, you know, you start feeling tears swelling up in your eyes every time you hear Answers. You're like, holy crap, what's gonna happen now? Because usually Answers is played at very critical moments. But not just that particular tune, even though that tune became very special to me throughout all of the events that I've experienced in the game. The tunes that they play in Shadowbringers, which are much more like rock focused and guitars and shit like that, they just really gel with me, because I really like rocking guitars, and all of the remixes that they do of Final Fantasy tunes, and just like all of the music as a whole is fantastic. Like, particularly as it climaxes in that very last cutscene of Shadowbringers, it just blows you away. The music is also fantastic throughout the whole experience. In terms of gameplay, it's not a massive shift from the previous expansions. Naturally, there's some new mechanics in some of the raids, as well as some new mechanics in dungeons. Some of them I liked, some of them I didn't like as much. I never really particularly like mechanics that kind of throw you off of a platform and just kill you. Those are particularly frustrating for me. I don't know why. Probably has something to do with the fact that I'm very scared of heights. So whenever I'm forced to see my character fall from great height and die, it's very frustrating for me. But, you know, you learn them and then you start avoiding them. It's not really a big deal. Naturally, you also get a new class with this particular expansion, which is the Gunbreaker, which, interestingly enough, is the class that I'm playing. Now, it's not necessarily because it's the last class to be added into the game. It's mostly because, like I've said, Final Fantasy VIII is the first Final Fantasy that I've ever played, and it was introduced to me by one of my cousins. And you guys will be like, how come you never played another Final Fantasy? My parents didn't believe in consoles when I was young, so they just got me a PC. That's the way that went down. And yeah, that's why I never really was exposed to as much Final Fantasy as a lot of other people, naturally. But due to Final Fantasy VIII being the first Final Fantasy that I ever played, I was always somewhat fascinated by gunblades, and having a class that is all about gunblades and also a tank, which is my favorite role to play in MMOs, was very much a no-brainer. And so I played the entire thing through with the Gunbreaker, which is a very satisfying class to play. It brings just a smidge of utility in one of its spells, at least, and the fact that you can cast some of your defensive spells on some of your friends. But it's just very cool in terms of animations, the sounds of it. So I greatly enjoyed the gameplay overall, even though, like I said, the main reason why I come to Final Fantasy XIV nowadays is more so the story than necessarily just the gameplay. The gameplay is fine. I like it. It's fun. It's good stuff. But I'm not going to tell you that I'm like super interested in going and doing, oh, savage content or extreme content. You know, I think that those days for me when it comes to MMOs I'm not sure that I'm gonna be super into that type of stuff, but whenever there's like a new story bit, a new dungeon, or something that I'm interested in grinding, like something that I'm very curious to doing is on Tuesday, which tomorrow, hopefully if I edit this video in time, we're gonna have the relic weapons come up in the game, and that is something that I'm very interested in checking out because I never really engaged in the relic weapon grind, and I'm going to be able to do so for my class of choosing, so that'll be an interesting experience for me to go through still. And yeah, at this point, I haven't done all of the post-MSQ stuff. As a matter of fact, right after I record this, I'm probably going to be playing through the rest of it because I'm very close to, I think at least my chat has been telling me that I'm very close to like catching up on everything because I did the raids, did all of the MSQ stuff, and I'm currently just, I already did the first dungeon of the post-MSQ stuff, so I'm very close to catching up in content. And yeah, that's another thing that I wanted to bring up, which is I've had a fantastic experience with this game, not just because, you know, I liked it and the gameplay is good and the story and all of this stuff, but also because I was exposed to the Final Fantasy XIV community throughout because I live streamed the whole experience over on Twitch. And it's just a community that is very welcoming in this MMO, which even in the game itself, not just like in my Twitch chat or anything like that, but even in the game itself, whenever, like, for instance, in an instance, I might make a mistake because I might not be aware of a specific mechanic. I don't think I've ever been in a situation where someone would, like, you know, purposefully say, "Ah, noob, doesn't know about this," like you tend to get in a lot of MMOs. I'm not saying that's a bad thing that people say that. I don't care. I don't get affected by it. I'm saying that it's never happened in Final Fantasy XIV. Quite the opposite. Usually people are like, "Oh yeah, and during this mechanic, you should try to, you know, you have to do it this way. Otherwise, the boss does this and you're gonna die." Like, people are usually very welcoming to the point where when they notice that someone is doing a dungeon for the first time, and you just finish killing the boss or something, and they know that there's like a big cutscene coming, they'll even be like, "Okay, dude, hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the ride." Like, they'll actually wish you well. Like, they want you to, people in the community, they just want you to enjoy the game and have fun, which is very refreshing when it comes to playing an MMO. I'll tell you that right now. When people are not just taking a dump all over you if you made a mistake or something like that. Instead, they're like, happy to see new people join in, and they're happy to help out other people. And I think that the welcoming community is actually one of the biggest selling points of Final Fantasy XIV as a whole. Like, I think anyone that's like even a newcomer to MMOs, you might look at Final Fantasy XIV and be like, "Oh man, there's like 3 expansions already. Oh my god, I'm never gonna catch up, and it's gonna be so stressful, and I don't know if I want to get into this." Like, those are things that you really don't have to worry yourself with, because the community, if anything, is going to be much more helpful than I've seen in other titles, and that's just like another really big selling point of this game. In case you guys are wondering whether or not I recommend the game at this point, I feel like the video speaks for itself. It's one of the best stories I've experienced in a video game ever. Despite the fact that it has a considerable amount of filler, it is worth it in the end. There are huge payoffs for a lot of characters in this game, and it's just like a fantastic story all around. The gameplay is solid. I love the music in the game, which is really, really good. The dungeons, the raids, all of it is great fun. So yes, I recommend Final Fantasy XIV, and it has definitely become my favorite MMO of all time, surpassing WoW, which is something I never really thought would have happened. But Square Enix really has something special in this game, and it shows. Now, initially I had planned to do a spoiler section in this video where I was going to talk about the moments that marked me the most throughout my Final Fantasy XIV journey. However, I felt like that was going to make the video a lot longer than I intentionally envisioned, so I decided to make that its own separate project. So if that is something that you are curious about, stay tuned. The video should be hitting the channel soon after this one. But other than that, that is pretty much it for this video. And I do understand that a great majority of this video is extremely popular, positive, that is because my experience with Final Fantasy XIV has been really, really awesome. Now, I understand that not everyone is going to have the same experience I did because, I streamed the whole thing over on Twitch. I had a lot of people from the Final Fantasy community join in and give me tips on how to better enjoy the story, as well as kind of prevent other people in chat from spoiling the story to me. Like, it was a really fantastic experience all around. So it was maybe a little bit more ideal than the average player experience, but still that does not change the fact that I definitely think this is a worthwhile experience, even if you're someone that's not that into MMOs, just for the story itself. The biggest negative is the fact that, during the story, throughout the different expansions and stuff, there is a lot of filler in some of these stories, but like I said, the payoff is more than worth it. But anyway, like I said, that's going to be it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, hit the like button. If you guys did not enjoy it, hit the dislike button. Feedback is important. Feedback that you can also leave in the comment section down below. And as a matter of fact, please let me know, what is your experience with Final Fantasy XIV? How did you like it? Which one's your favorite expansion? All of that jazz in the comment section below. I'm really curious to hearing more from other players that have played it and have been surprised, either positively or negatively. I'm just really curious all around. If you guys usually enjoy my content, subscribe, hit the bell notification icon. I'll see you in the next one. Stay strong, and may your shields never break.